Hi folks, this is Abby Addison. Today we are going to be learning how to batik with washable glue. Here are all of my materials that we are planning on using today. We are starting with a fabric here that is 65% polyester and 35% cotton. It is a bleached muslin fabric, so it should take on our pigments really well from our acrylic paint. I have four different kinds of acrylic paint here. They are studio, so they're studio acrylic, so they're a little bit thicker. We'll use water to wash that down a little bit so that way it can soak into our muslin fabric a little bit better. I have our washable school glue. Again, it needs to be washable for this to work. I did find yesterday when I was working on some patterns that it leaves a really thick line. So I also decided to try out a fine liner applicator. You can see that I've used this before for paint, so it is a little bit stained from previous projects, but I was able to fill it with glue and it works super well. I have a couple paintbrushes, I have a palette so I can mix some colors, and then I also have my pattern that I'm planning on following today. So I started initially by drawing it out with pencil and then went over with Sharpie to make sure that I could see my pattern through my fabric really well. So let's take a look at what that looks like. You can see that my design comes through nice and easy, and I'm able then to go over with glue to start my design. So one thing that would be helpful as I'm working is actually to tape both things in place so that way nothing shifts as I am working on that. I'm just going to tape that into place here and a little bit at the bottom. I'm not going to do this whole design because I did practice this yesterday and it took a very long time to be able to do each. I will say that I did one with our regular school glue. Because it has a larger opening, it does create a much thicker line and it does tend to bleed a little bit more. And then I did a whole pattern also in that fine liner applicator. So I'm going to show the difference between both, and then we can talk a little bit about the pros and cons to each. All right, so we're going to start with our regular glue nozzle here. And I'm only going to do a portion of this because without quite realizing it, I did make a pretty detailed, complex pattern. I found that using the regular school glue doesn't quite show that pattern as well. So I'm just going to show you what that kind of looks like. All right, I'm going to pause there just so you can kind of see it up close. Carefully take that off my tape. That is an incredibly thick line, and you can see that I don't quite have all of the sharp curves and turns that I initially have with my drawing. I also know that there's no way I was going to be able to get those tiny petals around my flower on the inside of that pattern. So I decided to just keep it a little bit more simple. Now I'm going to show you what that example looks like instead by using a fine liner. Okay, so there is my example, small example, using the fine line applicator. If I hold it up closer again for you, you can see that it is a much thinner line, almost by 50% smaller, I would imagine. The one thing that is also nice about this is consistency can be a little bit trickier, but using that tip of the fine line applicator, you can actually kind of push that glue a little bit more into place by getting those sharp, sharp lines. The other thing you'll notice is it's such a thin line along some of these more bold areas that I actually think mixing both the fine line applicator and the regular new glue nozzle will actually work to the benefit of the pattern by mixing those two different types of lines, thick and thin. All right, after letting our glue fully dry, we are going to start that painting process. So we're going to add some water. I am going to use a smaller brush for this example. For the larger print, I did use a larger brush since I was really just kind of bleeding in larger areas. For this one, I'm going to use a smaller brush. I'm going to add some water to my color to kind of get it into a whole milk consistency. This is what I found works best, to have that pigment stay nice and bright and yet be nice and movable all at the same time. You can kind of see now my pattern is really starting to come through. That glue, even though it's so thin, is still doing a very nice job resisting all of the paint colors that I am laying down. Let's take a look at the back to see what that looks like. Sure enough, coming through really nice, still seeing that pattern. You can also see why we're putting down something underneath our workspace to make sure it doesn't go onto our tabletop. And we're going to set that aside, and you do need to let that dry, I would say, for a couple hours before we're going to have to wash out our glue. All right, so I went and grabbed some hot water straight from my tap. I just made it as hot as I possibly could, which luckily in our house is actually quite hot. I do have an old rag. This is kind of a painting rag that I keep in my studio. And then I have a fully dried example of my thicker painting with the glue. So I was able to do this. It is nice and fully dry. You want to make sure that your pigment is super dry before you put it into your hot water, or you will end up losing some of that color. So we're going to go ahead and start to wash out our glue. I'm going to wring out as much water as I can and lay out a cleaner area of my paint rag. You can see that that glue really started to loosen, and I'm getting lots of beautiful contrast between my dark areas and my white lines specifically. Now you can see that I used a lot lighter paints in some areas, and you're going to see a little bit less contrast with that space if you're using those lighter colors. All right, I'm going to use that rag, and I can kind of help work some of that glue off. Okay. You can feel that it's still pretty sticky. I think it would need some more bath time, but you're kind of seeing the process here. Now here is a almost fully dry example from earlier this morning that I did. You can see again that our lighter areas, you're seeing a little bit less contrast, whereas that darker spaces, you're seeing a heck of a lot more, and it really stands out. And I like how some of these colors tend to bleed together a little bit. So I'm kind of feeling that Delftware type pattern, but it's definitely like hinges more on the batik type pattern at the same time. So have fun. I'm going to be using these to make some soft sculptures next week, and I'm going to integrate a little bit of embroidery with it, and we'll see how it turns out.